They say the more you look at something, the more critical you are of it. The more you dissect and the more you analyze something, eventually you grow to resent it. Well, however, my relationship to this game is quite the opposite. For hours I've tried to find errors and shortcomings, but aside from the occasional nitpick, I think it's perfect. And that game is Link's Awakening. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is a game I'm very fond of. I used to play it on my Game Boy Advance on long car rides, though I could never get past the mysterious forest because it confused my 8-year-old brain. Looking back now, I can understand why I couldn't get past that area. The specific places you have to go to, getting the mushroom, going to the witch's hut, and using magic powder on the raccoon, yeah, I can see why I couldn't figure this out. Despite my confusion, I was perfectly content walking around the village, talking to NPCs, and playing the trendy game. One thing I specifically remember is finding the sword on the beach all by myself. Walking around the beach, I realized I could push the sea urchins out of the way with my shield, and found the sword that way. I remember being so surprised and happy with myself when I figured that puzzle out, but nonetheless, that memory has stayed with me all these years. In 2019, Link's Awakening got a remake on the Nintendo Switch, and my brother got it for Christmas that year. I don't distinctly remember that time of my life too much, but I assume I was too focused on playing Fortnite with my friends. But one memory that I do remember was in 2021 when I saw my brother play the game on an airplane. I saw the game and figured I'd take a shot at it when my brother was done playing it. Flash forward to 2023, Nintendo added Game Boy games to Nintendo Switch Online. When this happened, I had forgotten about the game to an extent, and thought it would be fun to revisit. On a vacation that summer, I decided to play through the game. The clear sprites on the Nintendo Switch screen and seeing the Game Boy game run on a TV was a pretty cool experience. The sound especially caught my attention. Right when you boot up the game, you hear this dark theme accompanied by the ship sailing in the darkness. As thunder booms in the background, it cuts to Link on the ship with a rope wrapped around his arm, desperately fighting the storm. Thunder crashes into the ship and the scene fades to white. A girl can be seen walking across a beach. She abruptly stops as she finds Link's body and hurries over to him. As she shakes him to try and wake him up, the camera pans upwards to show the windfish's egg atop a mountain. First-time players have many questions. What happens to Link next? What's with the giant egg on the mountain? Who is the girl, and what island are we on? The mysterious intro cutscene is a great hook for new and returning players alike. I remember booting this up on my old Game Boy back in the day and just watching this cutscene all the way through. The artwork definitely caught my attention. The wide shot of the ship sailing in the thunderstorm helps convey the powerlessness and solidarity of the ship. When the camera zooms into Link's face, it shows a very impressive piece of art for the Game Boy. Link's fluffy hair and signature cap rendered on the tiny Game Boy screen looks great, even more so on the DX color version. The beach especially looks so expressive and colorful in DX, it's no wonder why the game won Best Graphics and Sound from Nintendo Power back in 1993. The sound, especially, is by far one of the best soundtracks on the original Game Boy. It's insane how expressive and varied the game can sound. The intro song, The Storm, has crunchy thunder sounds that contrast with the dark music accompanying it, and that really conveys the theme of isolation and mystery. This dark opening contrasts with the light-hearted and iconic title theme that takes the original Zelda title theme and puts its own fast-paced spin on it. Playing the game during vacation was a cool experience. I finished it in a couple days and had a great time with it. This was about a year ago, so I don't remember too much of how I felt about the game. But I recently got a fully modded Game Boy Advance SP and figured I'd play Link's Awakening again. I thought it would be interesting to play the game how the original developers intended, without save states, rewinding, or any modern conveniences in the remake I had used previously. Immediately, I found out how obscure the game really is. This can be a bad thing or a good thing depending on how you look at it. A common criticism I hear about the game's obscurity is when Eagle's Tower is your next destination. The owl tells you, "Go to the mountain tower, fly like a bird." And when you go to the mountain, he tells you to go east. And there are little to no hints that guide you toward getting the blue rooster under the bird statue. And I can understand why people could get frustrated at this, but at its core, Zelda is meant to be an adventure game. So progression isn't meant to be straightforward and direct. Think about the first Zelda game and how crazily obscure that game can be. If someone were to hit a roadblock, then they would just go around the island using their newly acquired items to solve puzzles that they would come across. If players took the same approach, then they would find that south of Yuku Prairie, there is a sign puzzle that, when completed, you obtain the frog's Song of Soul that can liven up unliving things. If you go north to the top of Tal Heights, you find an NPC talking about the Flying Rooster, which would eventually lead to the Flying Rooster's grave in Maybe Village. In my personal opinion, I think this game strikes a perfect balance between too obscure and too obvious. If you fully explore the island and talk to every NPC, it makes the game relatively trivial to go through. The movement is enjoyable, and controlling Link with his various abilities is a breeze. Using the Rock's Feather to navigate gaps and chasms in the floor is so satisfying. I think it's the fact that Link maintains his momentum as he jumps, opposed to the remake where it feels like he stalls a little bit before jumping. Walking around the world feels larger in DX compared to the remake due to the screen transitions. This is because every screen transition in DX feels more thought out and meticulously planned. However, the lack of screen transitions in the remake allows for faster and more fluid exploration. But, as you'll see later on, this does not make the game inherently better. Saving in the game is a bit obscure too. You have to press the A, B, and select buttons, and then press start. Also, a first-time player wouldn't know how to do this if they didn't have the game manual, and they would have to resort to Googling it. Just a minor inconvenience, but an inconvenience nonetheless. Now, time to nitpick. I just want to remind you that I love this game, and I think it's one of my favorite games, and my favorite Zelda game ever made, but this game can get on my nerves sometimes. Dying to a boss is very annoying. This game can be challenging and brutal at times, and dying to a boss just sucks at times. Especially in the Bottle Grotto, this boss's attack patterns are confusing for first-time players, and dying to him sends you all the way back to the start of the dungeon. This can be annoying, but in the end, I understand it because it just gives me more incentive to beat the boss. And I do love a challenge from time to time. It seems like today the worst thing a game can do is waste the player's time, and Link's Awakening definitely doesn't care about this. Whether it's talking to an NPC or talking to the owl, text boxes can scroll past very slowly. This isn't bad on a first playthrough since certain text boxes can give useful game tips and hints, but what really annoys me are the constant repeated text boxes that happen when you interact with certain objects. Every time I see these parachutes, the same text box appears when I get close to them. Even after I have the Pegasus boots equipped, I still see this text box appear. This happens with rocks and pots that you can lift up, and the ice blocks in Turtle Rock. This happens too with the map and compasses in each dungeon. For the compass, it takes about 7 seconds to scroll through the entire text blurb. This also happens too with the secret seashells, but like the ice blocks, they don't appear as frequently as the other examples. Also, item management can be annoying. This one isn't particularly a bad one since it's pretty much the only item management system they could have done on the respective hardware. But it's still pretty annoying to have to go into the menu, select the power bracelets, go out of the menu, and use them. As you play through, it's not bad and you get used to it. Despite my nitpicks I have with small parts of the game, as a whole, I love it. The character designs are so expressive and lively considering the hardware they were developed for. Looking in the game manual, it is so impressive to see how similar the game sprites look to the official artwork. The game had a few commercials I could find, and they're all pretty bizarre. One of them is a Japanese commercial that used puppets to portray the characters. It's kinda weird seeing the game's 4 main characters at the start, plus a random skeleton. It goes through the intro cutscene of the game, but, in puppet form. It's cool to see their depiction of a chain chomp, since they've never had red lips or a tongue. but it conveys the overall feel of the game very well in such a short commercial. The box art was very similar to the A Link to the Past box art. I always thought this was confusing, but now that I look back, I can understand that in order to sell the game, it had to appear like a portable Link to the Past in order to draw in players who were familiar with the game. Reviews back then praised the game for its engrossing story and gameplay, but frequently complained about the item management system. Link's Awakening went on to sell 3.8 million copies by 2004, and its DX counterpart sold around 2.2 million. On February 13th, 2019, more than 25 years after the original release, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening was announced. The description of the video describes the game as a reimagining, and not a remake. In my opinion, this is the best way to describe a release like this. It doesn't downplay the original, and it allows the developers to implement new things and features that would be unfaithful to the original. We saw completely remade landscapes and textures. Everything was completely built from the ground up. The character models, while stylized, were very faithful to the original game's official artwork. The game looked beautiful, the sun shining off the grass, the foggy, mysterious woods, and even walking around Maybe Village, all showed off the in-game art design and how far we've jumped in technology since the 1990s. Especially the opening sequence, when the shot switches to behind Link's shoulder to show another angle of the iconic opening from the Game Boy game. If you played Link's Awakening before, you instantly know it's up. And even if you've never played Link's Awakening, then you still have the same questions everyone had back in 1993. What happens to him next, and what's with the giant egg? It conveys the same themes and messages as the original Game Boy games, in the same, if not an even better way. The opening of the reveal trailer perfectly showcases exactly what longtime fans were wanting from rumors of a potential remake, as well as drawing new players in with a beautiful new 2D Zelda game. The next look we got at the game was during E3 2019 in June, where the trailer details more specifics about the story, showcases more environments, and uses some of Link's items. The trailer focuses mostly on combat and exploration, revealing many dungeon mini-bosses and regular bosses. At the end, the trailer showcases the new Dungeon Builder mode with everybody's favorite Zelda character, Dampé.
Okay, I don't believe anymore. Holy shit.
When this trailer first came out, this part of the game looked great. A new game mode included with an already fantastic game. And after that, we got a release date of September 20th, 2019. When the game released, an overview of the game came out with it on YouTube. Aside from spoiling the entire plot twist, this was a pretty good trailer to go alongside with the release of the game. Speaking of, the release of the game was immediately met with raving critical reviews. 10 out of 10, 5 out of 5, 4.5 out of 5. It seemed like this game was perfect. Everyone agreed this was a perfect game. Seeing as I think the original is a masterpiece, you would expect me to say that this is the definitive version of the game and the original pales in comparison. But overall, comparing the two, I believe both releases stand on their own, and are equally both great games. The remake, as I'll be calling it, has qualities of a reimagining, but I believe falls more into the remake category overall. When somebody says reimagining, my mind immediately goes to something like the Resident Evil 2 game from 2019. It reimagines the story in a completely new context and changes up the gameplay almost entirely. While the Link's Awakening remake changes up some parts of the gameplay, it's definitely not enough to warrant the reimagining title. So, what has changed and what has stayed the same? All of your questions will probably be answered. First, I obviously have to talk about the visuals. Completely overhauled and infinitely better compared to the original, I think the remake looks beautiful. Looking at the game in a vacuum, it looks serviceable for a Nintendo Switch title, but playing the original beforehand and comparing the two, it's pretty much night and day. Especially with the lack of screen transitions, the whole world feels much more expansive and lived in. However, with these beautiful graphics and lack of screen transitions comes a necessary evil: frame rate issues. Yeah, especially when using the Pegasus boots, the game can drop crazy frames. Like when loading huge patches of grass, the game can hitch up big time. I think this game can benefit the most from the extra processing power of a potential Switch 2. Looking at the game running in Yuzu at 60 FPS, it's crazy how much better the game looks. Also, I thought the 8-directional movement system would be worse than the original, but overall it didn't get in the way that much and felt like it was implemented in a good way. And for some reason, you can't use the D-pad for movement whatsoever. Locking the player to using the analog stick is relatively clunky, and I would have liked the option to use the D-pad. And of course, with this new movement system comes a much more different combat experience. Instead of swinging your sword in 4 directions like the original, the remake lets you swipe your sword in 8 directions. In addition to this, the sword extends to 2 tiles more than the original. In the original, your sword would only hit the tile directly in front of you, but in the remake, your sword swipe gets the tile directly in front of you, as well as the 2 right next to them. This makes sword combat more trivial and easy in the remake, as you don't have to position yourself directly next to an enemy to hit them. Also, of course, compared to the original, the saving system is much more streamlined and simple. Overall, these changes have been relatively small, but there are a couple that pretty much overhauls the entire game experience and sets it apart from the original. One of those changes is the teleportation. In the original, you had these teleportation areas where if you fell down them, you could cycle through the other teleportation areas that you found. You could also play Manbo's Mambo on the ocarina to send you to Manbo's Pond every time. I think this system was great, since it made you think about where you wanted to go in the most efficient way. If you were in the desert and wanted to go to Yuku Prairie, then you would have to travel to the Animal Village teleporter and cycle through until you reached the place you wanted to. This system, while complicated and tedious, worked and improved the player's relationship to the island by making them memorize how to reach certain areas and overall helping the game's aspect of adventure. Since the map is so small, you can cross it left to right in about 2 minutes if you know where you're going. So if anything, the teleportation system is just to make things more convenient, since the map is so small anyway. The teleportation system is perfect for the size and scale of the game. I see people complain about it, but in the end, you can always just spend a minute or 2 walking there, instead of instantly teleporting there. Thankfully, the game doesn't have an instant fast travel system. At least, not the original. In the remake, the game replaces these teleportation holes with fast travel platforms. They also increase the amount of these fast travel spots to include them all over the map. They also made it where Manbo's Mambo let you choose what fast travel platform you wanted to go to in an instant, no matter where you were. This one change, to help with the pace of the game and to improve the game, single-handedly makes the game worse thematically and gameplay-wise compared to the original. With instant access to fast travel at any time, this actively discourages the player to explore the island and, in turn, makes them less attached to the island. Thematically, this causes the story to have less impact than it would. Gameplay-wise, this addition completely throws off the pacing in an already short game. The fast travel makes sense in Breath of the Wild, since that game is an expansive open world and pretty much needs it, but in this game, the world is well fleshed out where every single area of the game has meaning. Fast travel, if anything, encourages the player to ignore the island. Most people enjoy the addition of this fast travel, but as a die-hard fan of the original, I think the fast travel demeans the purpose of the game and ruins the whole purpose of exploration and adventure. From the added fast travel to easier bosses to even increasing the amount of heart containers, the remake is laughably easy in comparison to its Game Boy counterpart. I've already talked about the fast travel, but one change that is so confusing to me is the added cracks in bombable walls. Especially in Turtle Rock, bombable walls are so apparent in the remake, it's distracting. In the original, bumpable walls could be completely flat with no indication. However, only early game dungeon would have those bombable wall cracks in them. But like I said, later dungeons like Turtle Rock would have absolutely no indication. As you can see, these are the same room, but bombable cracks are much more apparent in the remake. In the original, to solve the puzzle, you would have to look at your map to see that there is a room you haven't been in, and then cross-reference a room that you were in with the map, so the player determines that there must be a bombable wall there. The whole puzzle makes you think critically and doesn't feel like mindless wandering. Puzzles like that in Zelda are what makes me enjoy the series. However, in the remake, it is so ridiculously apparent that there is a bombable wall there. Like, there isn't any critical thinking needed for this puzzle. You just see the cracks and place a bomb. In the original game, you would have to use the map to cross-reference the room you're in with the room above you, and it's fun to figure out. But in the remake, puzzles like this are blatantly given to you, and it feels so mindless. And I don't even think I used the dungeon map even once in the remake, because the dungeons were so easy. The dungeon bosses, comparably, have also been made easier too. If you've played the original, you will definitely remember the boxer mini-boss and how frustrating it was. Well, he's back in the remake, and as expected, he was nerfed to all hell, and now he is so easy. He attacks so slowly that you would have to be actively trying to lose to get hit by him. He also doesn't get all up in your face like the original, which pretty makes him only do his charge-up attacks, which, like I said, are so slow that even a toddler could win this fight. The battle was fun on the original because of how intimidating and quick the boxer was, but here, on the remake, the boxer is a shell of what he was on the original. I feel like the developers tried to make bosses in the remake more complicated than they were in the original. The first boss, Moldorm, now closes his weak spot after you hit him once. You have to wait 6 seconds to be able to hit him again, and the whole fight is just way too drawn out. They also closed up most of his death pit compared to the original, so now the whole fight is just easy and drawn out, which is very boring. For the genie, they made his fire attacks travel slower and do less damage, which makes the fight a breeze compared to the original. They also made the Dodongo snakes close their mouths after they eat a bomb, which just makes the fight boring and drawn out. The anglerfish can move around a bit for whatever reason, and he's still the easiest boss. Originally, you could kill the Armos Knight with just arrows, but now you need to spin attack him or something. That's the only one they made more difficult, which is a good thing, I guess. The Color Dungeon Beetle, Goma, the little guy with the ball, the Stone Hinox, all of these bosses are so easy compared to the original. It's somewhat confusing why they made all these changes. Maybe to appease critics who hate challenging games, or to appeal to newer fans. Whatever it is, the newer, easier bosses just make the game mindless and boring. It feels like the main goal of this game is to try and fix mistakes that the new developers thought made the original games worse. Like with Majora's Mask and its remake, certain changes can be attributed to the developers looking back on their work and thinking things could be improved on, when they were just fine the way they are. Another change in the remake is the ridiculous abundance of secret seashells. In the original, there were 20 that were required to get the final reward, but in the remake, they've added 30 more on top of that, a grand total of 50 scattered around the island. In the original, since there were only 20, it felt like an actual reward for a puzzle you had to solve. Now that there are 50, every shell you collect feels less impactful, and more Easter egg hunt-like. I think what they were trying to do is keep tradition with past Zelda games who have similar collectibles. Ocarina of Time's Skulltulas, Link Between Worlds Mai-Mai's, and even Breath of the Wild's Koroks. It seems like the developers prioritize the quantity of the collectibles and not the quality. In the original, there were only 3 rewards, 2 shells and a level 2 sword, which made it short and concise. Since you didn't get a heart piece or anything else, that incentivized you to gather more, since the player doesn't know what happens when you collect all of them. Mystery and intrigue would encourage them to collect more shells. Also, the shells weren't in any obscure place. If you cut down every piece of grass, picked up every pot or rock, and dug up every out-of-place patch of grass and fully explored every dungeon, you would have enough shells to get the level 2 sword. This, of course, might seem like a lot to ask, but any player would do these things naturally. Since the game includes 6 extra shells, then it actually gives the player a little bit of leeway in the case they missed one. Compare that with the seemingly out of place and obscure shells in the remake. Like playing the Song of the Windfish where the walrus was. There's literally nothing around this area that hints to this solution, and I just resorted to digging up the entire area with my shovel. Even GameXplain tried digging up the entire area around where that stupid shell was hidden. I think to compensate, the developers just slapped on a band-aid solution to try and remedy the obscure spots they hid them. Introducing the seashell sensor, which lights up in the corner of the player's screen whenever a shell is around you. I think this inclusion to the game is quite frankly terrible, and if anything, makes the game more tedious than fun. Now, why do I hate this thing so much? Just for what it stands for, the whole item is just the developers admitting they hid the shells in horrible spots. At the start of the game, when you don't have the sensor, the shells seem like a fun little collectible you might come across. But as soon as you get 15 of them and go to the shell mansion, you receive the seashell sensor. When the sensor lights up in the corner of your screen, this results in the player cutting every piece of grass, or in the worst cases, digging up every single tile to try to find a seashell. This makes the game go from fun collecting seashells when you come across them, to tediously digging up every single tile in an attempt to dig the shell up. And when this happens, and the player still doesn't find it, I will 100% guarantee they will look up the answer online. I know, because that's what I did. Naturally, when you see the sensor go off, you might want to get it in that instant and not ignore it. When you try everything you can think of, you result to looking it up. There's definitely an NPC that tells you to throw a bomb in the holes of Tall Tall Heights, or play the Song of the Windfish next to the walrus. But most people aren't going to speak to every NPC and find that out. They see the sensor light up and do everything and anything to try and get the shell. It completely ruins the sense of exploration and adventure. I'm fine with the increased amounts of shells, if anything it adds to the exploration of it all, but the sensor ruins it all. Okay, moving on. The Rock's Feather was one of the greatest items in any Zelda game, just for how useful and varied it can be across the whole game. You maintain your momentum throughout the jump, and just makes the game more smooth and satisfying. However, in the remake, they completely butcher the whole item. When you use it jumping in the air, you go less distance and it halts your momentum at the start of it. It just makes it so unsatisfying to use and not fun at all. Also, you can't use it underwater to quickly gain height, like in the original. Also, I didn't play the Dampe mode because I forgot to.
Alright, fuck you.
Overall, I feel like the remake is fantastic. While I have absolutely been dogging on it, those criticisms are relatively small, and as a whole, I feel like the game is still a wonderful experience to play through. The animation, character designs, and graphics all make this game so cool to play, especially if you're familiar with the original. However, the fast travel, boss changes, the easier difficulty, and especially the stupid dumb seashell sensor degrade and detract from the best experience you can have playing this game. The changes they made, I guarantee, were made in good heart. The developers clearly cared about making this a great game, and even surpassing the original. But in the end, all they did was make a game that, in some places, failed to surpass the original. Now, how would I change the remake to make it the definitive Link's Awakening game? Well, I would take away the teleportation spot next to Dampe's shack, since it's literally a 10-second walk to Manbo's pond. And for Mambo's song, I'm going to keep it like the original, where you only teleport to his pond when you play the song, but remove the teleportation spot from the pond like it is in the original. I would also make the bosses more challenging and reverse any attempt to make the boss more progressive and easy to newcomers. I think the boss's original difficulty was to encourage players to try hard to defeat them, memorize attack patterns, and feel a sense of progression and getting better. I would also completely remove the seashell sensor, and in turn, add more NPCs or more dialogue to current NPCs that tell you where certain seashells are hidden, to reward players for exploration. Like for the walrus one, Marin could reference the walrus and say how you should go back and play him the song, and for more stuff like that to allude to those seashell locations. Like an NPC next to the hole where you throw a bomb in, saying, "You could throw a bomb in there," or something like that, to encourage exploration and talking to NPCs. These changes, especially the seashell one, would make the remake more faithful to the original and fix almost every problem the remake has. This brings up the question, which game do I recommend you to play? I've said many good things and many bad things about the two games, but which one comes out on top? Well, I think the original has more charm. The simple 8-bit graphics and music add to the charm and style of the game. Honestly, it's more fun to play the original just due to how stylistic it is. In the original, the decreased amount of seashells and heart pieces make every little bit of progression feel more impactful. The screen transitions make the world feel much more expansive, and makes it feel like the original developers poured every little bit of care into every part of the game. Also, the game is cheaper. On Nintendo Switch Online, it's about $20 for the yearly subscription, which at most is $40 less than the remake. Also, the game is on more platforms, from the original Game Boy to the 3DS. You can easily play it on previous hardware. And most important of all, it feels like an adventure. The original Game Boy game is shrouded in so much mystery. The ominous opening cutscene, while simple, does a fantastic job to draw the player in. The game also doesn't hold your hand by highlighting the map or telling you where a shell is. Simply put, the game feels less hand-holdy and expects the player to figure out things on their own, which in turn feels much more like an adventure. But you would probably play the remake because of its improved graphics compared to the original. The remake looks so beautiful and is one of the best looking Switch games. The game is also much more approachable in a casual perspective. Some players like when the game holds your hand, and some players like easy games and hate it when they die even once. For those kinds of people, this game is perfect since at times the original can be difficult and hard to get into. In conclusion, I recommend you play the original if you want a more authentic experience of the game. Really play the game how the developers intended. And I would recommend you play the remake if you want a more easy, approachable, modern Zelda experience. Once again, I am only hating on the remake because of the confusing changes they made to try to improve on the original. In the end, Link's Awakening is one phenomenal game with two great releases. If you enjoyed this video, go check out my other one about Zelda's music. It's much shorter and easier to watch than this one. My next video will be about Metroid, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.